Marie Walker sat on the edge of the hospital bed, staring at the bland, off-white walls of the clinic. The antiseptic smell mixed with the scent of fresh laundry created a strange, sterile comfort. It was her third week at the clinic, recovering from a mysterious illness that had left her drained and fatigued for months. But what weighed heavier on her heart was not her illness. It was her husband, Rob. Rob had been her rock for so many years. They met when they were both fresh out of college, their lives ahead of them, filled with dreams and aspirations. Rob was ambitious, always striving for more. He now worked 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet for the both of them. They had struggled for years to buy a house, and Rob's endless overtime shifts were the price they paid to keep it. Marie appreciated his efforts, but the long hours had begun to take their toll on their relationship. He was rarely home, and when he was too exhausted to talk, let alone connect. Marie had been feeling increasingly lonely, like she was carrying the weight of their marriage on her own. The clinic had provided her a temporary escape from the overwhelming solitude. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't responsible for anyone but herself. Yet, even in the clinic's tranquility, there was a void, a sense of longing she couldn't shake. Then, there was Dr. Ben Ellis, the young, charismatic intern assigned to her case. He was fresh-faced, barely out of medical school, with a bright future ahead of him. Every day, he came into her room, his white coat crisp and his eyes full of youthful energy. Dr. Ellis was not only dedicated to his patients, but had a way of making them feel seen. He had been particularly attentive to Marie, checking in on her more often than necessary, always with a kind word or a gentle smile. At first, Marie brushed it off as professional courtesy, but over time, she began to notice how his visits extended longer than his rounds required. They talked about life, their dreams, and everything in between. Dr. Ellis was easy to talk to. He listened, really listened, in a way that Rob hadn't for years. There was a warmth in his presence that filled the cold void Rob had left behind. She hadn't realized just how much she missed being heard, being cared for, until Ben came into her life. One afternoon, as Marie lay in her bed, flipping through a magazine without much interest, Ben knocked gently on the door before stepping inside. "How's my favorite patient today?" he asked, his smile lighting up the room. Marie smiled back, a flicker of warmth spreading through her chest. "Just counting the days until I can get out of here." Ben chuckled and sat on the edge of her bed, a gesture that had become more casual as the days passed. "You'll be out of here soon enough. We just need to make sure you're back to full strength before sending you home." "Home," Marie repeated softly, her voice tinged with melancholy. "Sometimes I wonder if there's anything left for me there." Ben's brow furrowed in concern. "What do you mean?" Marie sighed, turning her gaze to the window where the autumn leaves fluttered in the wind. "My husband. He works so much. We hardly see each other anymore. It's like we're strangers living in the same house." There was a pause, the kind that usually came when someone didn't know how to respond. But Ben, to her surprise, didn't look away. "That sounds hard," he said, his voice gentle. "You deserve more than that, Marie." The sincerity in his voice hit her harder than she expected. She had heard variations of this sentiment before, from friends, from family, but hearing it from Ben, in this small, quiet room, felt different. His words were not just an observation. They were an offering, a validation of her feelings. Marie bit her lip, trying to suppress the surge of emotions bubbling inside her. "I don't know what to do anymore. I love him, but I don't know if that's enough." Ben's eyes softened, and for a moment, there was something unspoken between them. He reached out and gently took her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "You deserve to feel loved," he said quietly, his thumb brushing lightly across her skin. "And to be happy." The room suddenly felt too small, too charged with an energy that neither of them had anticipated. Marie's heart raced, her mind torn between the loyalty she still felt for her husband and the undeniable connection she had formed with Ben. She wanted to pull her hand away, to create distance, but instead, she found herself squeezing his hand in return. "Thank you, Ben," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He gave her a soft smile, but his eyes held something deeper, something that both excited and terrified her. There was a moment, brief but intense, where it seemed like the world around them faded, leaving only the two of them in that quiet room. Before she could say anything more, Ben stood up, breaking the moment. "I'll check on you later," he said, his voice a little too composed. "Get some rest." As he left, closing the door softly behind him, Marie let out a shaky breath, her mind reeling. She knew she had crossed a line, even if nothing had happened yet. There was a spark between them, one that couldn't be ignored. That night, as she lay in bed, Marie's thoughts were consumed with guilt and desire. She thought about Rob, about how hard he worked, how much he sacrificed for their life together. But then she thought about Ben, about the way he made her feel seen, heard, and wanted. It was a feeling she hadn't experienced in years, and now that she had tasted it, she wasn't sure she could let it go. The next day, Ben's visits became more frequent, and their conversations grew deeper, more personal. The tension between them was palpable, and despite her efforts to resist, Marie found herself drawn to him in ways she hadn't anticipated. It was dangerous, reckless even, but it was also exhilarating. For the first time in a long time, she felt alive. As the days turned into weeks, Marie knew she was playing with fire, but the flame was too enticing to extinguish. What she didn't realize was that every moment she spent with Ben was a step further away from her old life, a life that, once shattered, could never be pieced back together. Marie couldn't stop thinking about Ben. His presence lingered long after he left the room. His smile, his touch, the way he listened to her in a way Rob hadn't in years. It wasn't just the physical attraction, though that was undeniable. It was the connection they shared, something deeper, something that made her feel alive again. As the days at the clinic stretched on, the time she spent with Ben became the highlight of her day. She knew she was stepping into dangerous territory, but the temptation was overwhelming. Rob had been working 2 jobs for over a year now, trying to provide for them, but it came at a cost. They barely spoke anymore. Their conversations had become transactional: groceries, bills, repairs. The love was still there, she believed, but it had been buried beneath the weight of responsibility and exhaustion. And in its absence, loneliness had crept in like an uninvited guest. One afternoon, as Marie sat by the window of her hospital room, watching the autumn leaves drift lazily to the ground, Ben entered. She could tell something was different about him today. There was a tension in his posture, a hesitancy in his step. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Hey," he greeted softly, walking toward her. "Hi," she replied, turning to face him. There was an awkward pause before either of them spoke again. "I brought you something," Ben said, breaking the silence. He pulled a small book from his coat pocket, a worn paperback that looked as though it had been read countless times. "It's one of my favorites. Thought you might like it." Marie took the book from his hands, her fingers brushing his as she did. The touch was electric, sending a shiver down her spine. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. For a moment, neither of them moved. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, emotions they both knew they shouldn't entertain. But it was too late. The line had already been blurred, and they were standing on the edge of something that could change everything. "You're welcome," Ben replied, his voice low. He took a step closer, his gaze locking onto hers. "Marie, He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The look in his eyes said it all. Marie felt her heart pound in her chest as Ben reached out, gently cupping her face with his hand. She should have stopped him, pulled away, reminded herself that she was a married woman, but she couldn't. She had been starved of affection for so long that this moment felt like a lifeline, something she couldn't bring herself to reject. His lips brushed hers softly, testing, as though waiting for her to pull away. But Marie didn't. She leaned into the kiss, her heart racing, her mind screaming at her to stop but her body refusing to listen. The kiss deepened, becoming more urgent, more desperate, as though they both knew this moment couldn't last. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing heavily, Marie felt a rush of emotions she couldn't quite place. Guilt gnawed at her, but it was overshadowed by the thrill of what had just happened. I shouldn't have done that," Ben said, stepping back, running a hand through his hair nervously. You're married, and I'm your doctor. Marie nodded, but her mind was still spinning. I know, she whispered, feeling a tear prick at the corner of her eye. But Ben shook his head, interrupting her. It's my fault. I've crossed a line I shouldn't have. You've been going through a lot, and I'm sorry. Marie felt a lump form in her throat. She wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, that she had wanted it too, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat there, staring at him, unsure of what to do next. Ben looked at her for a long moment before finally speaking again. I think I should transfer your care to another doctor. Marie's heart dropped. The thought of him leaving, of not seeing him again, was unbearable. She had become so dependent on his presence, on the way he made her feel. No, she blurted out before she could stop herself. Please don't. Ben looked torn, his brow furrowed in thought. Marie, this isn't right. I don't want to make things worse for you. Don't leave me, she whispered, tears threatening to spill. Please, Ben. I can't do this without you. He hesitated, his eyes searching hers for any sign of resolve. When he didn't find any, he sighed deeply, rubbing the back of his neck. All right, he said softly. I'll stay. But we can't. This can't happen again. Marie nodded, but deep down she knew it wasn't that simple. The connection between them was too strong to be ignored. She had tasted something she hadn't felt in years, something she didn't want to let go of. But there was a storm brewing inside her, a battle between what she knew was right and what her heart craved. The days that followed were a delicate dance. Ben continued to visit her, though now there was a palpable tension in the air, a lingering charge every time they were alone. They avoided discussing what had happened, but the memory of the kiss hung between them, heavy and unspoken. Each time he entered the room, Marie's heart would race, her body betraying the guilt she tried to suppress. At night, as she lay in the clinic bed, her thoughts would drift back to Rob. She thought of him working late, coming home to an empty house, probably too tired to even eat dinner before collapsing into bed. She knew she was being unfair to him. He was working so hard to give them a better life, but in the process, he had become a ghost in their marriage. Marie couldn't help but wonder if Rob had noticed how distant she had become in the months leading up to her hospitalization. She had been withdrawing emotionally long before Ben entered her life, retreating into herself as the weight of their strained relationship bore down on her. Rob was a good man, honest, hard-working, but his absence had become a wound that never healed. And now, she had found someone who filled that void. But at what cost? One afternoon, as Marie was flipping through the book Ben had given her, she received a call from Rob. She hadn't spoken to him much during her time at the clinic. His work schedule rarely allowed for long conversations. Hey, sweetheart, Rob's voice came through the phone, sounding tired but upbeat. How are you feeling today? I'm doing okay, she replied, feeling the familiar pang of guilt. How about you? You must be exhausted. He chuckled softly. You know me. Work keeps me busy. But don't worry about me. Just focus on getting better, all right? Marie closed her eyes, letting his words wash over her. This was the man she had married, the man who loved her unconditionally. And yet, here she was, betraying him in the worst way. I miss you, Rob added after a pause. Tears welled up in her eyes. I miss you too. They spoke for a few more minutes before saying their goodbyes, and as Marie hung up the phone, she was overwhelmed by the weight of what she was doing. She was standing on the precipice of something that could ruin everything, and she wasn't sure if she was strong enough to step back. The guilt gnawed at her, but so did the desire. And deep down, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. Marie's heart grew heavier with each passing day. The clinic, once a refuge from her strained marriage, had now become a maze of conflicting emotions. She was caught between two worlds, the life she had built with Rob and the one she was dangerously close to creating with Ben. It was as though she were standing on the edge of a cliff, staring down at the abyss of her choices. Ben had tried to keep his distance after the kiss, visiting her less frequently and keeping their conversations strictly professional. But the more he pulled away, the more Marie realized how deeply she had fallen for him. She missed the warmth of his touch, the ease of their conversations, The way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. In contrast, Rob felt like a distant memory. Their phone calls were short, polite exchanges, just enough to maintain the facade of a normal marriage. He was still working long hours, often too tired to talk for more than a few minutes before heading off to bed. Marie hated herself for feeling relieved by his absence. The thought of facing him, of pretending everything was fine, was unbearable. One chilly evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast the clinic in a soft orange glow, Marie found herself once again alone in her room, her thoughts spiraling. She had been staring at the same page of the book Ben had given her for over an hour, unable to focus on the words. Her mind was elsewhere, on Ben, on Rob, on the choices she had yet to make. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart leaped, hoping it was Ben, but when the door swung open, it was one of the nurses. "Marie? There's someone here to see you," the nurse said with a polite smile. Marie frowned. Rob never visited without calling first, and she wasn't expecting anyone. "Who is it?" "He's waiting in the visitor's lounge. Says he's a family friend." A chill ran down her spine. It wasn't Rob. Her thoughts raced as she stood up, her legs unsteady beneath her. The nurse helped her into her robe, and together they made their way to the lounge. When Marie stepped into the room, her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't Ben, and it certainly wasn't Rob. Standing by the window, hands shoved into his pockets, was Greg Parsons, Rob's best friend. Marie hadn't seen Greg in months. He and Rob had known each other since high school and had been nearly inseparable, despite their vastly different lives. Greg was brash, always full of energy, and often teased Marie whenever they all got together. But now, as he turned to face her, there was no humor in his eyes. "Marie," Greg greeted her with a tight smile. "Mind if I sit?" She nodded, still too stunned to speak. They sat across from each other in the small room, the silence between them thick with unspoken tension. "I wanted to check in on you," Greg began, his tone casual but his expression serious. "Rob's been worried, you know. He doesn't say much, but I can tell." Marie swallowed hard. "I've been doing okay. The doctors say I'm getting better." "Good," Greg said, leaning forward slightly. "Good. But that's not really why I'm here." Her stomach dropped. "Then why are you here, Greg?" Greg's eyes locked onto hers, his voice dropping to a low, almost conspiratorial tone. "Rob works too hard. You and I both know that. And I've been thinking, maybe he doesn't see things as clearly as he should. Maybe you're not telling him everything." Marie's throat went dry. "What are you talking about?" Greg's gaze didn't waver. "I think you know exactly what I'm talking about." Panic surged through her. Had Greg found out about Ben? How could he possibly know? She hadn't told anyone, and Ben had been careful. But Greg's expression told her that he knew something. Something that made her blood run cold. "I've been hearing things, Marie," Greg continued, his voice growing sharper. "And I don't like what I'm hearing. Rob's killing himself with 2 jobs, trying to make things work for you too, and meanwhile, you're in here, cozying up to some doctor." Marie's heart pounded in her chest. She tried to stay calm, but the fear that gripped her made it impossible. "Greg, that's not true." "I..." "Don't lie to me," Greg interrupted, his voice now a harsh whisper. "I've seen the way you've been acting. Rob might be too tired to notice, but I'm not." Tears stung at the corners of Marie's eyes. She wasn't prepared for this confrontation, not from Greg of all people. He was supposed to be Rob's friend, not some detective prying into her personal life. "I care about Rob," Greg said, his voice softening just slightly. "He's like a brother to me, and I don't want to see him get hurt. So, I'm going to ask you one time. Is there something going on between you and this doctor?" Marie's mind raced, searching for an explanation, an excuse, anything that might get her out of this situation. But all she could manage was a weak, "It's not what you think." Greg sat back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "That's not an answer, Marie." She wiped at the tears that had begun to fall. "I've been lonely, Greg. Rob's never home. He works so much, and I feel like I don't even know him anymore." "That's no excuse," Greg shot back. "Rob's doing everything he can for you. For your future. And this is how you repay him?" Marie's chest tightened, the guilt overwhelming her. She knew Greg was right. She had no right to justify her actions, no matter how lonely she had been. Rob was working himself to the bone to provide for her, and here she was, betraying him in the worst possible way. "I haven't," she began, her voice trembling. "I haven't done anything." "Not really." Greg's eyes narrowed. "Not really? What does that mean?" "It means I made a mistake," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "But it didn't go too far. I swear." Greg stared at her for a long moment before finally sighing. "Marie, listen to me. Rob loves you. He would do anything for you. But if you don't stop this now, you're going to lose him." The weight of his words settled over her like a heavy blanket. She knew he was right, but the pull she felt toward Ben was undeniable. It wasn't just about the kiss. It was about the way Ben made her feel, alive, seen, valued. And now that she had tasted that feeling, she didn't know if she could give it up. "I don't want to hurt him," Marie said, her voice breaking. "I don't want to lose him." "Then end it," Greg said firmly. "Whatever's going on with that doctor, you end it. Today, before it's too late." Marie nodded slowly, the tears flowing freely now. "Okay." Greg stood up, his expression softening just a bit. "I'll tell Rob you're doing all right. But Marie, if I find out you've hurt him like this again, I won't be so kind next time." With that, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving Marie sitting alone with her guilt and shame. That night, Marie lay in her hospital bed, staring at the ceiling. Greg's words echoed in her mind, mingling with the memories of Ben and the deep ache of guilt that had settled in her chest. She knew what she had to do. She had to end things with Ben. There was no other choice. But the thought of never seeing him again, of returning to her lonely marriage without the comfort of his presence, felt like a death sentence. She wasn't sure if she was strong enough to walk away. As the night stretched on, Marie made a decision. Tomorrow, she would talk to Ben. She would tell him that it had to stop, that she couldn't see him anymore. It was the right thing to do, the only thing to do. But as the first light of dawn crept through her window, she couldn't help but wonder if she had already gone too far to turn back. The morning air was heavy with tension, though outside, the world seemed oblivious. Birds chirped on the window ledge, and sunlight streamed through the half-open blinds. But for Marie, everything felt darker, heavier. She had barely slept, her mind tangled with thoughts of Rob, Ben, and Greg's unexpected confrontation the day before. The weight of her actions, and the choices she had yet to make, hung over her like a storm cloud. She had decided. Today, she would end it with Ben. Her heart ached at the thought of never seeing him again, never feeling that warmth and spark that had pulled her from the emotional void she had been living in. But there was no other way. She couldn't keep lying to herself, or to Rob, no matter how far things had already gone. Marie took a deep breath, pulling herself out of bed. The hospital room felt colder than usual, the sterile walls closing in on her. She ran her hands through her hair, trying to calm her nerves. This was it. She had to put a stop to it before she shattered the life she had built with Rob, as fragile as it already was. Just as she was gathering her thoughts, the door opened with a soft click. Ben stepped inside, his familiar white coat slung over his shoulders, and that same gentle smile tugging at his lips. But today, Marie couldn't find the comfort in his presence that she once did. "Morning," Ben greeted, closing the door behind him and walking toward her bedside. He didn't notice the tension in the air, or if he did, he wasn't acknowledging it. "Morning," she replied, her voice quieter than usual. Ben sat down on the edge of the bed, his eyes scanning her face with concern. "You look tired. Are you feeling all right?" Marie felt a lump rise in her throat. How could he be so calm, so casual, when everything between them was about to unravel? She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Ben, sensing her hesitation, placed his hand on hers, a familiar gesture that once brought her comfort but now felt heavy with guilt. "Marie, what's wrong? You look distant." She pulled her hand away, standing up to put some distance between them. "Ben, we need to talk." His brow furrowed, and the playful warmth in his eyes flickered with concern. "What is it?" Marie turned to face him, taking a deep breath. This was harder than she had imagined, but it had to be done. Whatever's been happening between us, it has to stop. Ben blinked, clearly taken aback. What? Marie, what are you talking about? We crossed a line, she said, her voice trembling. That kiss, everything. I can't do this anymore, Ben. I'm married. Rob might not be around as much, but he's my husband. I can't keep betraying him like this. Ben stood, his face a mix of confusion and frustration. Marie, I know it's complicated, but what we have, this connection, it's real. I know you feel it too. She shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. That doesn't matter. It doesn't make it right. I can't keep lying to him, and I can't keep pretending this is something we can have. It's not fair to him, or to me, or to you. Ben's jaw tightened, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of pain in his eyes. So what then? You're just going to walk away? Pretend like nothing happened? Marie wiped at her tears, her voice barely a whisper. I have to. He took a step closer, his voice soft but laced with urgency. Marie, I care about you. More than I've cared about anyone in a long time. Don't throw this away because you're afraid. We could be happy together. I know we could. Her heart ached at his words. A part of her wanted nothing more than to give in, to let herself fall into his arms and forget the world outside this room. But she couldn't. She had already let things go too far. I'm not afraid, she said, though she wasn't sure if that was entirely true. I can't destroy my marriage. Rob might not be perfect, but he doesn't deserve this. I don't deserve this. Ben's eyes softened, and he took a step back, running a hand through his hair. I don't want to make things harder for you, Marie, but I can't just shut off my feelings. I won't pretend this didn't mean anything to me. Marie's tears spilled over, and she turned away, unable to face him. I know, but it has to end. The silence that followed was suffocating. Ben stood there, his breath shallow, before finally speaking again. All right, he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. If that's what you want. Marie's heart broke at the sound of his resignation. She wanted to run to him, to take it all back, but she stayed where she was, rooted in place by the weight of her decision. I'll transfer your care to another doctor, Ben said after a moment, his voice now more controlled. You won't have to see me again. The finality of his words hit her like a punch to the gut, but she nodded, unable to speak. Ben lingered for a moment longer, as if hoping she would change her mind, but when she didn't, he quietly left the room, closing the door behind him. Marie collapsed onto the bed, her sobs shaking her body. It was over. She had done what she needed to do, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a loss, a devastating, heart-wrenching loss. The next few days passed in a blur. True to his word, Ben had transferred her care to another doctor, and she hadn't seen him since. The new doctor was polite but distant, treating her with the professionalism she had come to expect before Ben had complicated everything. Yet, every time the door opened, Marie's heart would skip a beat, expecting to see Ben standing there with that soft smile. But he never came. Marie spent her days recovering, trying to focus on her health and preparing for her eventual discharge. Rob called daily, his voice still full of concern and exhaustion. She spoke to him as best she could, but the guilt was always there, lurking just beneath the surface. She hadn't told him about Ben. She didn't think she ever could. But Greg's warning still haunted her. If he had noticed something, who else would? And how long could she keep pretending that nothing had happened? Her secret felt like a ticking time bomb, one that could explode at any moment, destroying everything in its path. One afternoon, Marie was sitting by the window, staring out at the cloudy sky, when her phone buzzed. It was a message from Rob. I've got a surprise for you. Coming by the clinic tomorrow. Can't wait to see you. Marie's heart stopped. He was coming to see her? She hadn't expected him to visit, not with his hectic schedule. Panic gripped her as she thought of Rob walking into the clinic, into this place where her affair had unfolded. What if he ran into Ben? What if Greg had already told him something? Her mind raced with possibilities, but there was no way out of it now. Rob was coming, and she would have to face him. She would have to pretend that everything was fine, that she hadn't betrayed him in the worst way imaginable. But as the hours passed and the thought of seeing her husband drew closer, Marie realized something. She wasn't just afraid of being caught. She was afraid of facing the truth. The truth that, despite her guilt, despite her love for Rob, part of her still longed for Ben. And that truth scared her more than anything. The next morning arrived too quickly, and Marie could barely focus as she got ready. She hadn't slept, and her nerves were frayed to the breaking point. Rob's visit was supposed to be a happy occasion, his way of showing support after weeks of being apart, but all she could think about was the web of lies she had woven around herself. By noon, Marie was sitting in her room, waiting for Rob's arrival. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she wrung her hands anxiously, trying to calm the storm inside her. When the door finally opened and Rob walked in, Marie felt a rush of emotion so strong that she almost couldn't breathe. There he was, her husband, the man who had stood by her side for years, the man who had sacrificed so much for their future. He looked tired, worn down by the weight of his 2 jobs, but there was love in his eyes. Love for her, despite everything. "Hey, beautiful," Rob greeted, a wide smile on his face as he walked over and kissed her on the forehead. "I missed you." Marie's throat tightened. "I missed you too." He sat beside her on the bed, taking her hand in his. "I'm so glad you're feeling better. I've been worried sick about you." Tears welled up in Marie's eyes. She didn't deserve his concern, his love. But there it was, as steady as ever. "I have something for you," Rob said suddenly, his face lighting up as he reached into his pocket. Marie watched in stunned silence as he pulled out a small, wrapped box and handed it to her. "Go on, open it." Her hands trembled as she unwrapped the gift. Inside was a delicate necklace, a simple silver chain with a small pendant. It wasn't expensive, but it was beautiful, and more importantly, it was from him. "I wanted to get you something special," Rob said, his voice soft. "I know things have been hard lately, and I haven't been around much. But I love you, Marie. I always will." The tears she had been holding back spilled over, and she collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably. Rob held her tightly, whispering comforting words, completely unaware of the storm raging inside her. She clung to him, her heart breaking all over again. She had wanted so badly to find her way back to him, to fix what had been broken between them. But now, as she lay in his arms, she realized something terrifying. Even though she loved Rob, a part of her had already drifted too far, and she wasn't sure if she could ever come back. Marie spent the rest of the afternoon wrapped in Rob's embrace, feeling the warmth of his body against hers. His presence, once distant and strained by their circumstances, now felt comforting in a way she hadn't anticipated. But instead of easing her heart, it only deepened the ache inside her. As Rob's words of love and commitment echoed in her mind, the weight of her betrayal grew heavier with each passing second. She had ended things with Ben. She had tried to make things right, but it didn't erase what had happened. The kiss, the feelings, the line she had crossed. Rob had no idea, and every time she looked into his eyes, she felt the lie between them deepen. After a while, Rob pulled back slightly, tilting her chin up to look into her eyes. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked, concern softening his voice. "You've been quiet since I got here." Marie forced a smile, wiping away the remnants of her tears. "I'm just overwhelmed, I guess. It's been a lot, being here so long, and you working so hard." Rob nodded, his thumb brushing gently across her cheek. "I know. I wish I could have been here more. I've missed you, Marie. I hate being away so much." Her heart clenched at his words. He truly believed that his absence was the root of her sadness. He had no idea how much deeper it went. "I've missed you too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. They sat in silence for a few minutes, Rob's arm draped protectively around her. It was a moment she should have cherished, but all she could feel was the growing distance between them. She loved Rob, of course she did. He was her husband, the man she had vowed to spend the rest of her life with. But as she sat there, she couldn't deny the flicker of something else, the remnants of her feelings for Ben, still burning faintly in the back of her mind. The sound of Rob's phone vibrating pulled her from her thoughts. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, and sighed. "Work," he muttered. "I'm sorry, babe." I have to take this. I'll just be a minute. Marie nodded, watching as he stepped out of the room, his voice already fading as he spoke into the phone. The door clicked shut, and the silence in the room felt deafening. Marie let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling in her lap. She had to pull herself together. Rob didn't deserve this. He didn't deserve any of what she had done. But how could she tell him? How could she look him in the eye and admit that she had let another man into her heart, into her life? A knock at the door startled her, and she turned just in time to see Ben step into the room. Her heart leaped into her throat. This wasn't supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to be here. Ben, she whispered, her voice thick with panic. What are you doing here? Ben closed the door behind him, his expression unreadable. I'm sorry. I know I shouldn't be here, but I had to see you. Marie stood, her legs unsteady as she crossed the room toward him. You can't be here, she insisted, her voice low and urgent. Rob is just outside. He'll be back any second. I don't care, Ben said, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her heart race. I can't just walk away like this, Marie. I've tried, but I can't stop thinking about you. Marie's breath caught in her throat. Ben, please. I told you, it's over. We can't do this. He stepped closer, his voice soft but insistent. I know you're trying to do the right thing, but I don't think I can. I don't want to lose you. Her heart pounded in her chest, and she shook her head, backing away from him. You have to go. You have to leave before Rob comes back. If he sees you. But Ben didn't move. Instead, he reached out, gently taking her hand in his. Tell me you don't feel it too, Marie. Tell me you don't feel something for me. Marie's breath came in short, panicked gasps as her mind raced. She couldn't deny it. The truth was, she did feel something for Ben. Something that had taken root during those long, lonely days in the clinic. But it didn't matter. It couldn't matter. I can't, she whispered, her voice trembling. I can't do this, Ben. I can't hurt Rob like this. Ben's grip on her hand tightened, and for a moment, she thought he was going to say something else, something that would make her crumble. But then the door opened. Marie, you ready for? Rob's voice stopped dead in its tracks, and the room plunged into a deafening silence. Marie froze, her heart pounding so loudly she thought it might burst out of her chest. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto Rob's. His face was a mixture of confusion and disbelief, his gaze darting between her and Ben. What's going on? Rob asked, his voice low and controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. Ben quickly released Marie's hand and took a step back, but the damage had already been done. Rob had seen enough. Marie could see it in his eyes. His mind was already putting the pieces together, and the realization was hitting him like a freight train. I was just, Ben started, but his voice faltered, and he quickly turned to leave. I'll come back later. Rob didn't move as Ben walked past him and out the door. His eyes remained fixed on Marie, and the silence that followed felt suffocating. Marie opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. How could she explain this? How could she possibly make him understand when she barely understood it herself? Who is he? Rob finally asked, his voice cold, his eyes hard. Marie's throat tightened, her mind scrambling for an explanation. He's just one of the doctors. One of the doctors, Rob repeated, his voice dripping with sarcasm. And why was he holding your hand? It's not what you think, she stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. Rob, please, I can explain. Then explain it, Rob interrupted, his voice rising. Explain why some doctor is in here holding your hand while I'm standing outside, worried sick about you. Tears welled up in Marie's eyes, and she struggled to find the right words. I didn't mean for this to happen, she whispered, her voice cracking. I was lonely, and you were never home, and I don't know. Rob took a step back, his expression shifting from anger to something far worse, betrayal. So that's it? I work 2 jobs to keep us afloat, and while I'm breaking my back to take care of you, you turn to some doctor? Is that what you're telling me? Marie shook her head frantically, her tears flowing freely now. No, it's not like that. I didn't want this. I swear I didn't. It just happened. Rob's face twisted in pain, and he turned away from her, running a hand through his hair. How long? He asked quietly, his voice barely audible. What? How long has this been going on? Rob demanded, spinning around to face her again. How long have you been seeing him? It was just, Marie began, her voice trembling. It was just one kiss. I swear, that's all it was. Rob stared at her, his eyes filled with disbelief. Just one kiss, he repeated, shaking his head. And you expect me to believe that? It's the truth, she cried. I know it was wrong, but it was a mistake. A stupid, horrible mistake. Rob looked at her for a long moment, his face contorting with a mixture of emotions. Anger, hurt, disbelief. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and full of pain. Do you love him? Marie's breath caught in her throat. It was the question she had been dreading, the question she had been avoiding even asking herself. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, I don't. But even as she said the words, a part of her wasn't sure if she believed them. Rob's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, he looked truly defeated. I thought we were better than this, Marie, he said softly, his voice breaking. I thought we had something worth fighting for. We do, Marie insisted, stepping toward him. We do, Rob. Please, we can fix this. I love you. Rob looked at her, his eyes filled with tears. I don't know if I can believe that anymore. The words hit her like a punch to the gut, and Marie felt her heart shatter. Rob turned and walked toward the door, his hand resting on the handle as he hesitated for a moment. Without looking back, he opened the door and walked out. Marie stood frozen in place, her world crumbling around her. The clinic felt colder and emptier than ever in the hours after Rob left. Marie stayed in her room, staring blankly at the walls, her mind reeling from what had just happened. She had known there would be consequences for her actions, but she hadn't been prepared for the devastation of seeing the pain in Rob's eyes. She had broken something between them, something fragile but precious, and she wasn't sure if it could ever be repaired. The sound of her phone buzzing on the nightstand broke through her thoughts. She reached for it, her heart sinking when she saw the name on the screen, Ben. She hesitated for a moment before answering. Marie, Ben's voice came through, soft and full of concern. Are you okay? No, she whispered, her voice thick with tears. I'm not okay. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I'm so sorry, Marie. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I know, she replied, her voice barely audible. But it did. Do you want me to come over? Ben asked, his voice hesitant. Marie closed her eyes, the weight of everything crashing down on her. She wanted to say yes. She wanted to reach out to him, to let him comfort her, but she knew it would only make things worse. No, she said softly. You can't come here, Ben. Not now. Marie, Ben began, but she cut him off. Goodbye, Ben, she whispered, ending the call and dropping the phone onto the bed. As the silence settled over her once again, Marie curled up on the bed, pulling the covers over her as she let the tears come. She had made her choice. She had ended things with Ben. But the cost of that choice, the damage it had done to her marriage, was almost too much to bear. And as the hours dragged on, Marie realized with a sinking heart that she might have lost everything. Marie lay on the bed, numb to the world around her. The tears had stopped, but the hollow ache in her chest remained, a constant reminder of everything she had lost. She stared blankly at the ceiling, her mind replaying the scene with Rob over and over again. His broken expression, his quiet voice when he asked her how long it had been going on. It was all too much to bear. She had shattered the one thing she thought would always be there, her marriage. As the minutes ticked by, the reality of what had happened slowly began to sink in. Rob had walked out on her, and Marie didn't know if he would come back. The life they had built together, the years of love and partnership, now seemed so fragile, like something that could dissolve at any moment. Marie had made her choice, but now she was left alone in the wreckage of it all. Later that evening, the hospital felt even more isolating. The usual noise of nurses shuffling down the hallways and the faint hum of machinery provided little comfort. It had been hours since Rob left, and there was still no word from him. Marie checked her phone repeatedly, hoping for a message, a call, anything to tell her that he wasn't gone for good. But the screen remained dark. She knew she should give him space, but the uncertainty was unbearable. Marie's fingers hovered over the screen, tempted to call him, to apologize again and beg him to come back. But deep down, she knew this wasn't something that could be fixed with a phone call. Rob needed time to process what had happened, and so did she. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. Her heart skipped a beat, hoping it might be Rob, but instead, it was the nurse. "Mrs. Walker?" the nurse asked gently, stepping into the room. "You have a visitor." Marie's stomach dropped. She wasn't ready for another confrontation. "Who is it?" she asked, her voice shaky. The nurse gave a small, sympathetic smile. "It's Greg Parsons. He said he's a family friend." Marie felt her heart sink. Greg, the last person she wanted to see. After the confrontation they'd had days ago, she wasn't sure she could face him, but she knew she didn't have a choice. "Let him in," she whispered, bracing herself for whatever was coming. The nurse nodded and stepped aside as Greg walked into the room. He looked different, his usual cocky demeanor replaced with something more serious, more somber. He glanced at her with a mixture of concern and disappointment, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Greg broke the silence. "Marie." She nodded slightly, feeling the lump rise in her throat again. "Hi, Greg." He stood there for a moment, hands shoved in his pockets, clearly struggling to find the right words. "I heard Rob came by," he said quietly, his eyes scanning her face. Marie nodded again, unable to meet his gaze. "He did, and now he's gone." Greg sighed and stepped closer, sitting down in the chair by her bed. "Look, Marie, I'm not here to kick you while you're down. I know things between you and Rob have been tough for a while, but what were you thinking?" Her tears welled up again, but she forced them back. "I wasn't," she admitted, her voice cracking. "I wasn't thinking at all. I was just lonely. Rob was never home, and I felt so alone." Greg leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I get that, but you know Rob. He's working himself into the ground for you. He loves you, Marie." "I know," she whispered, her guilt consuming her. "I know that, but it didn't feel like it anymore. It was like he wasn't even there." Greg ran a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "You should have told him that. You should have talked to him before things got this far." Marie wiped at her eyes, the weight of her mistakes pressing down on her. I know I should have. But now I don't know if I've ruined everything." Greg looked at her for a long moment before sighing heavily. "Rob's hurt. That much is obvious. But he's not the type to just walk away from something without trying to fix it first. You know that about him." Marie nodded, but the doubt lingered in her mind. She wasn't sure if Rob would want to fix this. She had betrayed him, and even if it was just one kiss, it had broken something between them. Trust, once lost, wasn't something that could easily be restored. Greg stood up, his expression softening. "I'm not saying it's going to be easy. It's not. But if you want to save your marriage, you're going to have to fight for it. Both of you." Marie bit her lip, feeling the weight of his words. "Do you think he'll even give me the chance?" Greg was silent for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, I think he will. But it's up to you to prove that you're worth that second chance." Marie's heart twisted in her chest. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of losing Rob completely was overwhelming. Could they really come back from this? Could she? "Thanks, Greg," she said softly, her voice barely audible. He gave her a small nod before turning to leave. "I'll let you two figure it out. But don't give up on him, Marie. And don't give up on yourself." With that, he walked out of the room, leaving Marie alone once again. The next morning, Marie's emotions were still raw. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat. All she could think about was Rob, where he was, what he was thinking, and whether or not he would come back. She had played this scenario in her head 1,000 times, imagining all the ways it could go. But none of them gave her the closure she so desperately needed. Later in the day, the door opened quietly, and for the first time since Rob had left, there he was, standing in the doorway. His expression was hard to read. Part anger, part exhaustion, and part something else she couldn't quite place. "Rob," Marie whispered, her voice trembling. She didn't know if she should be relieved or terrified. He walked in slowly, closing the door behind him. He didn't say anything at first, just stood there, staring at her. Marie's heart raced as she waited for him to speak, her chest tightening with every second of silence that passed. Finally, Rob sighed deeply and sat down in the chair by the bed, his eyes meeting hers. "I've been thinking," he began, his voice low and steady, "about everything." Marie swallowed hard, her hands trembling in her lap. "Rob, I'm so sorry. Let me talk," he interrupted, holding up a hand. "Just let me say what I need to say." She nodded, her breath catching in her throat. "I know I haven't been around much," Rob said, his voice calm but laced with pain. "I've been working 2 jobs, trying to make ends meet, trying to give us the life we wanted. But in doing that, I didn't see what was happening right in front of me. I didn't see how lonely you were, how much you needed me." Marie felt the tears rising again, but she forced herself to stay quiet, to let him speak. "I can't say I understand why you turned to someone else," Rob continued, his voice breaking slightly. "But I get it. I wasn't there when you needed me, and someone else was. That doesn't make it right, but it makes sense." Marie's heart ached at the sadness in his voice. "Rob, Wait," he said again, taking a deep breath. "This hurts, Marie. It hurts more than I can put into words. But I'm not ready to just walk away from us. I'm not ready to give up on everything we've built." Her eyes widened in surprise, her heart racing. You're not?" Rob shook his head, his gaze steady. "No, I'm angry. I'm hurt. But I still love you. And if there's a chance we can fix this, I want to try." Marie's tears spilled over, and she reached for his hand, gripping it tightly. "I love you, Rob. I'm so sorry. I didn't want any of this to happen. I made a mistake." Rob looked down at their hands, his expression conflicted. "I don't know if things will ever be the same between us," he said quietly, "but I think we owe it to ourselves to try." Marie nodded, her heart swelling with a mixture of hope and fear. "I want to try to. I'll do whatever it takes, Rob. I promise." He met her gaze, and for the first time since he had walked into the room, she saw a glimmer of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago. "We'll take it one step at a time," he said softly, "but we'll take it together." Marie's chest tightened with emotion as she squeezed his hand, her heart filling with a fragile hope. They had been broken, but maybe, just maybe, they could find a way to rebuild. As they sat together in the quiet hospital room, Marie knew the road ahead would be difficult. Trust had been shattered, and healing wouldn't come easily. But they had made a choice, to fight for what they had, to face the consequences of their mistakes together. And for the first time in weeks, Marie felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. It wasn't over. Not yet. Subscribe to the channel and like this story if you liked it. Turn on notifications so you don't miss new stories. Click on the playlist on the right to listen to previous stories. See you soon.